morning to everyone. Thanks for joining us on this Saturday morning. I'd like to welcome you all to this presentation we've put together, Anti-Semitism, What You Need to Know. We're pleased to have you with us and look forward to being able to shed some light on such an important and timely issue. Excuse me. For those of you who don't already know us, TAL Global is an international security consulting and risk management firm with over 25 years of experience supporting domestic and international clients with a wide range of security and risk solutions. Today's presenters are Jonathan TAL and Dr. Doron Pely. Jonathan TAL is a founder and CEO of TAL Global. He has over 40 years of experience in the security industry, starting out as a military field intelligence officer for the Israeli Armed Forces. He's an anti-terrorism security specialist, a licensed investigator, a member of ASIS, ATAP, and former president of the World Association of Detectives. Dr. Pely's academic and business career has focused on a multidisciplinary approach to facilitating risk mitigation, conflict resolution and de-escalation, and negotiations in local, international, national, and business-focused environments. He earned his PhD at King's College London, has researched cross-cultural conflict mitigation, advised counterterrorism organizations, taught conflict de-escalation to law enforcement, and consulted multicultural municipalities on vulnerability reduction and cross-cultural negotiations. He's a former lieutenant in the IDF and a retired intelligence officer with the Israeli police. And with that, I hand it over to Dr. Pely.
Thank you, Julie. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure and an honor to meet you. Even though I cannot see anybody, I'm talking to a screen. A word of warning before I start, I'm nursing a cold and I may start coughing. Apologies in advance. This morning, we're gonna focus on anti-Semitism. We're gonna look briefly at the history of anti-Semitism. Then we're going to examine some forms of anti-Semitism, and we're going to end up with some ways of mitigating, hopefully mitigating the vulnerabilities that emanate out of anti-Semitism. I want to start with a quote from Christopher Wright, FBI director. It's an interesting quote. It definitely caught my attention. And the quote is, for a group that accounts for about 2% of the population of the US, they, the Jews, account for almost 60% of all hate crimes. That's something that we want to keep in mind when we think about anti-Semitism, the conjunction of anti-Semitism, anti-Israel, and anti-Zionism, the results of those things, and how to cope with them. Next slide, please. So let's start with the template definition of anti-Semitism. It's usually cut and dry. Anti-Semitism is a form of hatred and discrimination directed at Jews. It has existed for centuries and has evolved over time, taking on different forms in different contexts. And indeed, when we talk about the we talk about anti-Semitism, even though, for example, Muslims or Arabs are also Semitics, we're talking about Islamophobia in that context and anti-Semitism in the context of Jews exclusively. More to the point, anti-Semitism is not only a form of hatred, it's a worldview, it's a state of mind, it's a philosophy, and more than anything else, it's a mood, it's an expression of mood, of anger, of fury that expresses itself in scapegoating a specific group of people, namely Jews. Next slide. So for the purpose of this discussion, I divided anti-Semitism into old and new anti-Semitism. So old anti-Semitism basically started with the introduction of monotheistic religions and of Jews onto the stage of history. But I'm going to start with anti-Semitism, established anti-Semitism in the Middle Ages, 11th to 14th century, when anti-Semitism was mostly of a religious flavor. Everybody was religious at that time. If you were not religious, you were most likely dead, because blasphemy and heretic behavior was not tolerated at all. So when you look at Jews who lived as minorities within non-Jewish, mostly Christian populations, every time something bad happened in the community, Jews were scapegoated. When there was a famine, when there were plagues, Jews were accused of being the cause, even though the causality was very difficult to establish. In general, causality is difficult to establish anyway. The result, persecution, massacres, expulsion, forced conversions, specifically with respect to false conversions. Even when Jews accepted false conversions, they were still looked at with suspicion by the converting community. So it was not such a great deal to convert to Christianity. In the late Middle Ages, the beginning of Enlightenment, what is called the Enlightenment, the modern period, anti-Semitism switched from a religious-based to a secular-based prejudice. And it basically can be seen as a response to the fact that Jews started acquiring an economic and cultural footprint in the community. So now when Jews were traders and bankers, and they started participating in the cultural life of the community, with it came jealousy, and with jealousy came the secular brand of anti-Semitism. If you didn't like something, it was the Jews. If there was economic hardship, it was the Jews. If there were cultural problems, it was the Jews. In the 19th century, with the ascent of scientific exploration, there was a development of a scientific anti-Semitism, scientific brand of anti-Semitism, where Jews were basically portrayed as the inferior race. They were not only the inferior race, they were contaminating the superior races, and basically damaging the gene pool by mixing with pure race communities. Let's move to the next slide, please. So we arrive at the 20th century. The 20th century was basically the peak of anti-Semitism, of grand scale anti-Semitism. The Germany, the ascent of Germany, the Nazi Party, Nazism, and World War II, and with it, the Holocaust, which was the mechanism through which the Nazis basically thought about devising a final solution to what they called the Jewish problem. And they were quite successful. They managed to exterminate about 6 million Jews. They also killed millions of Slavics, people from Slavic countries, homosexuals, people with various physical or emotional deformities, and Zigeuners. So after World War II, we can see some decline in anti-Semitism. Basically, it was a decline that emanated from embarrassment. The success of the Nazis brought about a substantial amount of embarrassment in European nations that considered themselves the crown of civilization, and then they had to face an outcome that was so horrific that shaming and some embarrassment brought a decline, but the core narrative survived. They survived because they became embedded in the cultural DNA of the cultures that make up Western, Northern, and Eastern Europe. And they, of course, migrated with the people who migrated from those communities, particularly and specifically for our discussion, to the United States. And then we move to the 21st century, where there was a resurgence of anti-Semitism that is associated with the movement to the right of various countries in Central Europe, specifically Hungary, where an ex-Hungarian is now an American citizen, George Soros, is basically the quintessential reviled symbol of anti-Semitism, both at an individual level and at the state level. If you need to hate someone, it's George Soros. He's 95 years old. He even doesn't remember himself anymore, but he's hated vociferously throughout Central and Eastern Europe, and in the United States by conservative circles. The caricature on your screen shows basically the image of the fat, self-satisfied Jew that is defiling the white, pure race. Let's move forward. And we're moving on to the new anti-Semitism. The new anti-Semitism is a different amalgamation that combines old anti-Semitism with radicalized Muslim nationalism, anti-colonial perspectives that are hugely associated with what we call the new left, anti-apartheid, and hatred of Zionism, the state of Israel. Everything goes into one pot and comes out as a new picture that you can see as the new anti-Semitism. And this is what you see these days on your television screens and when you read newspaper reports. The caricature on your screen gives a good demonstration of what the new anti-Semitism is. On one side of the scale, you have basically all the trodden subgroups of humanity that are usually Black and brown, and of course, of a lower economic level. On the right-hand side, you have a single white male, and in the background, you have a very big Jew. Note the American and Israeli flag. They usually come together these days. You may find it interesting to note that the big Satan is the United States and the small Satan is Israel. And the Jew is basically putting his finger and disturbing completely the balance of nature as it's supposed to be, bringing all the power and hegemony to the white side, to the white male side of the equation. for the purpose of this discussion, of course, the Jew became a white male representative. Until then, he was Semitic. Semitic is much more on the brown side of the spectrum, but that created an inconvenience of association, so the Jew became white for this purpose. Let's move on, please. So we can see expressions of new anti-Semitism in bodies, for example, like BDS, the Boycott, Divest, and Sanction movement. That is a huge movement at this point, financed by government, by NGOs, by private people. It really is a significantly powerful movement that we want to pay attention to on an intelligence level, for example. And in addition to that, there are some interesting groups on the horizon. For example, JVP, the Jewish Voice for Peace, that is basically Jews who, under the claim of anti-Israeli and anti-Zionist and pro-Palestinian messages, are actually expressing hugely anti-Semitic views. You can see the caricature. It's an Arab caricature on the right, basically tells the story. And in terms of narration, there's one quote that I selected here of a Chicago college professor, a history professor, that justified the recent October 7th Hamas attack in Israel by saying, quote, after 75 years of Israeli white supremacy. Of course, that's just a piece of a quote, but you can see that this professor assigned white supremacy to Israel. So the group that for centuries, for generations, were chased and chastised as non-whites, all of a sudden became not only whites, but symbols of white supremacy. That's how narratives create a reality. The note below basically says that all the anti-Semitism didn't disappear. It's still operating alongside the new variant. Let's move to the next slide, please. So we're going to play a couple of videos that will create a picture, a little more understandable picture of where anti-Semitism comes from and how it expresses itself. Please, Julie.
I was born.
I'm sure all of you know
with a father
this guy.
that was a Nazi. Think about that.
You used the story of your father to try to reach people who are getting sucked into groups that propagate hate. Mm-hmm. Talk about making that connection.
My father was, and so many other millions of men, was sucked into a hate system through lies and deceits. And so we have seen where that leads. As I've seen it firsthand, how broken those men were, the kind of atrocities that happened, how many millions of people had to die, and then they ended up losers.
Please go to the next slide, Julie.
There's a growing worry for the Jewish community of France. Since the October 7th massacre by Hamas and Israel's hardline response, anti-Semitism has proliferated across the country.
So thank you, Julie. I'm glad that you stopped. This is basically a description of the impact of anti-Semitism in France. This is recent, of course, in response to the conflict in the Middle East. And so there's a conflict in the Middle East, but the graffiti on the wall says Sale Juif, Sal Juif means dirty Jews. So there's a problem with the Zionists. You can see the mentions of the Zionists of the world, yeah, below, but they're bundled together with the dirty Jews. Jews are never clean. Remember, Jews belong to the dirty side of the equation. Please continue.
From verbal abuse to graffiti, physical assaults, as well as death threats. Now France's top brass has had to respond in kind.
10,000 policiers, gendarmes.
10,000 police officers,
Yes,
gendarmes,
okay.
and scientists.
So what is basically saying is that the French government decided to allocate 10,000 policemen, federal policemen, to protect the Jewish community in France. There are currently less than 500,000 French Jews. That means one policeman for every 50 Jews in the country. Talk about personal security. I thought you guys would want to internalize that particular fact. Let's move to the next slide, please. So this is an interesting story. Please run the video.
The mob surging through an airport in Russia this weekend, searching for Jewish passengers on a flight from Israel, is the latest example of rising anti-Semitism globally. And here in the U.S., fears are also rising among Jewish Americans.
You can stop, please. So this is an event that I'm sure most of you folks met. It took place in a Russian Republic, a place called Dagestan, one of the Stan. Stan are a group of Muslim republics that were part of the Soviet Union, and then later most of them remained parts of the Russian Federation. And in this case, basically a mob overran the local airport looking for Jews. By the way, some of them were detained and arrested, went before a judge, and they received very light sentences in response to what they did there. Let's continue, please. So let's look at some numbers to give a quantitative face to anti-Semitism. This is Anti-Defamation League, fairly fresh data. And for example, we see that in the 2 weeks following the October 7th eruption of hostilities, there were 109 anti-Israel rallies in the United States, mostly on college campuses, some outside, but mostly on college campuses. There were also 312 anti-Semitic incidents during the same period. And when we talk about anti-Semitic incidents, we talk about a spectrum that goes from one side, physical attack, including shooting and attempted murders, to basically cursing, yelling, and accosting people on the street just because they look like Jews or they belong to a group that is affiliated with Jews. And an interesting piece of statistics, since October 7th, nearly 1,000% increase in the daily average of violent messages mentioning Jews in Israel in white supremacist and right-wing extremist channels. And that's without counting Twitter and the other social media platforms that have basically exploded with anti-Semitic verbiage, mostly because it allows individuals to feel affiliated with a very large group, and it allows them to do that with anonymity. So you get to voice your opinion, belongs to an obviously active majority, and yet you remain unnamed, mostly unnamed. Let's move to the next one. focusing a little more on the Bay Area, mostly because you guys operate in the Bay Area and you probably want to know about this. So these are just examples of some anti-Semitic events in the Bay Area. I'm not going to go through all of them, and I am confident that you guys are familiar with some, if not all of them. The picture on the right-hand side is of an ice cream chain owned by a Jewish woman, and you can see what happened to one of the storefronts in San Francisco. Quite aggressive. In addition to that, we can see that even before October 7, and it's important to understand that the anti-Semitism did not wake up on October 7. So on January 16, we have a group of anti-Semitic protesters in front of a synagogue in Palo Alto. And lo and behold, they conjoin two messages: death to Jews and free Palestine. And the reason I'm highlighting this is because a lot of people say, what do you want from me? I'm against Jews, I'm against Israeli actions in the Middle East, in Palestine. And basically I'm saying free Palestine. It's important to understand that when you free Palestine, you mean free Palestine from Jews. And when you associate the two messages together, you see what's on the surface and what's slightly below the surface, and quite easily, with the slightest provocation, comes to the surface. Another interesting indication, a swastika carved on a tree at Stanford University, on a campus of Stanford University, a student at San Jose State University, Jewish-owned businesses vandalized, and something that is quite interesting and is connected to what I said about rage, about anger. People attack cemeteries, Jewish cemeteries. They vandalize and overturn headstones in Jewish cemeteries. I'm not going to go, it will take a line of lectures to explain what leads such behavior to attack the dead. But this is a very popular pastime in Europe, and it has migrated to the United States and has made it to your neighborhood as well. Definitely worthy of paying attention to. Let's move to the next slide. One of the characteristics of the new anti-Semitism is that it, being new, it also has a new platform. And instead of newspapers or pamphlets, now there is social media to express yourself. And we can see an interesting expression. This is Twitter. I'm too old for X, so I'll remain with Twitter if you don't mind. So here's a message on Twitter: more than 4 Jewish pigs killed in Jerusalem today by the Palestinian bomb. You can see that the writer is not a native English writer or speaker, and also unschooled in the necessity to camouflage. So it's Jewish pigs. It's quite interesting because the conjunction of Jews and pigs is not very successful. Jews traditionally don't really consume pork products. A few more messages. In June of 2022, a Jewish woman in San Francisco received a social media message that said, "I hope you and your family are all slaughtered." A Jewish man in Oakland received a message that was a little more specific: "You Jews are all responsible for the world's problem." That leaves no stone unturned. very conclusive, and it's all the Jews and all the world's problem. And of course, what emanates from it as a conclusion is if you remove the Jews, you remove the problems. Again, it's important to understand the amount of rage and anger that needs to fuel to generate statements like this. August of 22, a Jewish business in San Jose was targeted by a group of social media users. So you're not talking about individuals, you're talking about people using social media to get together and, for example, initiate boycotts. If you remember the boycott, divest, and the movement, the BDS movement. A Jewish school in San Mateo was targeted by groups of social media in a very aggressive way, and Jewish synagogues throughout California, throughout the United States. In this case, a Jewish synagogue in Berkeley that was targeted by a group of social media users. They basically took over the synagogue's website. Let's move on. Another quote that is meant to basically explain the relevance of all this to our business today, and that is a quote by Andrew McCabe, a former deputy director of the FBI, who said terrorist activities overseas always inspire terrorist activities in the US. And since we have a peak of terrorist activities overseas, this means that if Andrew McCabe knows what he's talking about, we should be anticipating terrorist activity in the US. And since intelligence is about anticipation rather than improvisation, here's something that we want to start anticipating from. Let's move to the next slide, please. I want to talk a little about the threats of anti-Semitism, and for the purpose of this discussion, and in a rather arbitrary manner, I divided them into two groups, planned and spontaneous. And of course, either planned or spontaneous can be initiated by individuals or by groups. So planned threats can be initiated by individuals against principals or against their family members, against their property, against their place of work, against their vehicles, etc., etc., etc. It can be planned and executed with relation to institutions that are affiliated with principals, for example, synagogues, Jewish community centers, foundations, universities, anywhere where principals or people associated with principals appear. You would want to think about the possibility that somebody with a nasty disposition, with an anti-Semitic or an anti-Jewish or anti-Israeli disposition is planning something. And of course, there are planned protest events, very popular these days on university campuses. I'm sure that you guys meet this, and there's going to be an overspill, a spillover of those things outside of campuses. You're going to see it. Kids are going to come home, and things are going to happen closer to where they live rather than where they go to school. The other type of threat is a spontaneous one, and it happens quite a lot. If you can find dozens of videos with today's presence of CCTV almost anywhere. There are quite a few videos. People are crossing in the streets. You identify someone as a Jew. Rage comes to the surface. You lose the ability to control yourself, and violence ensues. Sometimes it's verbal violence, and in a lot of cases, and progressively, increasingly more so, it's physical violence. Let's move to the next slide. Here are just a couple of examples. This is a guy, a 28-year-old, who basically took it upon himself to assassinate Jews for being Jews. He basically scouted 2 locations, and when in one location a person left, he accosted him and shot him, and then moved to another location, found somebody who left the service and shot him as well. Again, with the help of some intelligence and CCTV, he was detained and is charged. Let's go to the next one. This is a different brand of physical threat, not against individuals, but against property. You see here a guy with a Molotov cocktail and a good hoodie. He forgot that he has a logo, a very prominent logo on his hoodie, but he comes with a Molotov cocktail, threw it at the synagogue. The result, if I'm not mistaken, was a minimal damage to the door of the facility. Of course, it could have been much worse. Let's move forward. I want to dispel the notion that Jews cannot be anti-Semites. It's very, very important when we think from an intelligence perspective on the profiling of threats, of potential threats, that we don't discount Jews. At this point, and increasingly in the future, it will, in my estimate, be Jews, for a variety of reasons that I'm not going to go into right now, are becoming quite accomplished anti-Semites. And here you see one case. This is a descendant of a Holocaust survivor who basically was detained and indicted in connection with threat to attack an NYC synagogue. Talk about playing the spectrum. Let's continue. Just a couple of examples of cyber stalking. A man charged in North Carolina, sending threatening emails. Obviously not a very smart individual. If he wasn't so angry, he might have given a bit of a thought to the fact that he will be hunted and discovered and brought to justice. And the other one is even more amazing. This is a junior law partner in partly owned by Jews, a law firm that's partly owned by Jews. And it took him 2 years of harassing anti-Semitic messages to be caught. I don't know, somebody was sleeping on the job there, but he was arrested, fired, you'll be glad to hear, and he will stand trial. Oh, he actually stood trial, and he got 2 years. Next slide, please. So I want to touch a little on the transition from cyber messages, from information that makes its way to the social platforms, and the transition to manifestation, physical manifestation. And here's a good one. So we have Elon Musk, needs no introduction. He has a beef with the Anti-Defamation League, who's been tracking his good work on Twitter since he became the owner of that particular toy. And he tweeted that ADL is being the biggest generators of anti-Semitism. Somebody picked up on that, created a leaflet that basically targeted the ADL. So it was a transition from the social media to the printed media. Here's a leaflet, and this leaflet expands, and it says that Jews wage war on American freedoms. So it's a transition from regular attacks on Jews on social media to creating a picture of Jews as enemies of the American reality of freedom. Of course, we have a flyer here. This flyer is seen by people. It's a trigger, a potential trigger for additional rage. Let's move forward. And we cannot these days have a discussion about anti-Semitism without talking about the place of artificial intelligence in anti-Semitism. And nobody is surprised to discover that AI and anti-Semitism cohabit, and they cohabit on both sides of the coin. Artificial intelligence empowers anti-Semitism, and I'll explain in a minute how, and also artificial intelligence can be used to fight anti-Semitism. The way anti-Semitism empowers, artificial intelligence empowers anti-Semitism is quite interesting. In the process of generating the huge database that is the engine of the artificial intelligence program, there's a process called training. And for the purpose of training, the people that create this program throw a huge pile of data into the computer and let the algorithm digest it. It's called training. Now, if the data contains anti-Semitic elements, and it inevitably does, then the trained artificial intelligence engine is going to be anti-Semitic. It has no morals. If you are old enough to remember, garbage in, garbage out. And that's exactly what happens. And artificial intelligence is not personally anti-Semitic, it's technologically anti-Semitic. And you can, of course, use exactly the same machine to sift through material, try to detect anti-Semitic materials and remove them. And that's basically everything, I think. Yeah, that's the thank you slide. And I really want to thank you. I haven't seen a single face. I don't think you've seen my face. I
Now
know
they
that
have.
I have. I'm sorry?
Now they have.
Now they? Okay, yes. Yeah.
The question we have is for you, Doron. Your thoughts about whether anti-Semitism in the US will grow in the next decade.
The short answer is yes. And the reason is that while anti-Semitism used to be almost the exclusive domain of the right, it has now migrated across the spectrum, and it is now feeding both the right and the left wings of the ideological extreme. And since the center ideologically, politically, and emotionally is being eroded for a variety of reasons, one of which is social media, and there's a few others, it's reasonable to anticipate that with this growth and with the erosion of the center, and with Jews being the quintessential scapegoat for anybody with any gripe, probably anti-Semitism will expand.
Thanks. That seemed to be a pretty easy answer, but obviously you could expand on that for hours, I'm sure.
Yeah, I can. If you have another 3 hours, I will.
And if there's nothing else, we can go ahead and close. Yeah, thanks very much to both of you again. We hope this has been informative and useful for our viewing audience, and we welcome all questions that were not answered today on anti-Semitism and its results, or any other security-related matter for that matter. Just feel free to visit us at talglobal.com and click on the Talk to Us button. So thanks again, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.